As an instructor in philosophy, I've had the opportunity to ask hundreds of my students over the last few years the following question: where did philosophy begin? It is likely that the response you're thinking about is the same one I usually get: ancient Greece. Maybe some of you with a deeper understanding of the discipline might start talking to me about Thales, the first scientist philosopher of the ancient Western world, who proclaimed that the first principle and the basic nature of all things is water, and who is also famous for having predicted the year of a solar eclipse in the middle of the battle between the Medes and the Lydians. Or you might go general with it and start talking to me about the Ionian city of Miletus, a thriving seaport and important center for global commerce in the ancient world, located in contemporary southwestern Turkey. It is this location which has for centuries been called the birthplace of science and philosophy. The place where thinkers like Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes turned away from answering the big questions of the cosmos through appeals to personalized gods, where aitia, the Greek notion of causality, would no longer be understood as a question concerning who, as in which god, is responsible for X event, but through a more naturalized and impersonal question of what is responsible for X event, which is how we understand causality today. This narrative on the origins of philosophy is, however, relatively new. Up until the end of the 18th century, most historians of philosophy located the origins of the discipline in the Orient, or more specifically in the Egyptian world. As Peter Park shows in his book, Africa, Asia, and the History of Philosophy, it wasn't until the racial anthropology of Christoph Meiners, supported by the leading German philosophers Immanuel Kant and G.W.F. Hegel, along with their pupils of course, that the Greek origin of philosophy narrative became dominant. The Greeks themselves credited Egypt for the birth of the discipline. The 5th century BC rhetorician Isocrates, for instance, stated that all men agree that the Egyptians are the healthiest and the most long of life, and that for the soul they introduced philosophy's training. The 1st century BC historian and geographer Strabo held that Plato had spent 13 years with Egyptian sages in the capital city of Heliopolis, and that Plato's philosophy was deeply Egyptian. Since at least the 7th century BC, with the Egyptian ruler Psamtik I, who boosted diplomatic relations with Greece, the Greeks would be learning from the Egyptians. In his histories, Herodotus was convinced that this opening was central for the development of philosophy in Greece. But Egyptian philosophy goes back way further. At the very least, it goes back to the 14th century BC pharaoh Akhenaten, who in his struggles against the polytheistic priestly elite class postulated what some have considered to be a proto-scientific worldview, rooted in the figure of Aten, who is considered a personification of solar energy. Just like 8 centuries after, with the so-called birth of philosophy in Greece, various thinkers would postulate a substance or element out of which everything emanated from. For Thales, it was water. For Anaximenes, it was air. For Heraclitus, it was fire. Akhenaten's Aten can likewise be viewed in a similar manner, as the solar divine element out of which everything comes into being. But the depth of Egyptian philosophy and its potential influence on the development of philosophy in Greece goes way deeper than this. Following the death of Pharaoh Akhenaten, the priestly class returns to power, but this time their views are much more developed. As scholars have shown, post-Akhenaten priests were developing the notion of an unknowable, hidden, divine oneness. This plurality of the universe which we're constantly engaging with, in other words, this many, developed out of this ineffable but supreme oneness. This view, of course, is reminiscent of the Eleatic school, specifically the figure of Parmenides. This means that one of the central questions in all of Western philosophy, the question of the one and the many, was being pondered over in Egypt already by the 2nd millennium before the birth of Christ. Egypt also produced many other precursors to philosophical positions that we attribute to Greece. As Donald Redford shows in his 2010 book, City of the Ram Man, the story of the ancient Mendes, the sages of Mendes argued that the supreme being could be represented as the unity of the 4 elements: Orisis, which represented water; Re, which represented sun or fire, Shu, which represented air, and Jeb, which represented earth. Again, this deeply resembles the four elements theory that would be developed by the qualitative pluralist Empedocles in the 5th century BC. Perhaps the most shocking is the finding of Platonic ideas, specifically the theory of the forms, being found in 2nd millennium BCE Egypt. In his 1998 Genesis in Egypt, the philosophy of ancient Egyptian creation accounts, American Egyptologist J.P. Allen shows how Egyptian priests already distinguished between things and what they called divine words, which is the term they used for what we may call today concepts, or in its Platonic language, forms. The things in the cosmos were seen to be copies of these divine words, as they called it, or forms, as we might call it today. Just like in hieroglyphics, these images were understood to be themselves copies or representations of concepts. This is, in essence, expressing some of the central ideas in Plato's theory of the forms. What is perhaps even more impressive is that some scholars have argued that through texts like The Immortality of Writers, found in 1920, 400 miles north of the Nile River, in a village called Deir el-Medina, we can trace Egyptian philosophy to 3,200 years before Christ. Contemporary scholars are also noting how the word philosophos, the Greek term from which we get philosophy, meaning love of wisdom, might itself be a Greek translation of the Egyptian concept me-rik, which also means lover of wisdom. While contemporary scholarship is showing the Egyptian roots of philosophy and the influence of this philosophy on the Greeks, today we continue to generally hold the notion of Greece as the birthplace of the discipline, a notion derived from early 19th century racist anthropology. How would our reading of history, how would our reading of the present change if the discipline that embodies the best of human thinking was understood as arising from Africa, and only centuries after making its appearance in Europe?